Does Genshin Impact have power creep? Well, what is power creep? In simplest terms, power creep is the power level of characters and challenges in the game increasing. It's when the latest characters simply deal more damage or grant bigger buffs or are just in general better than the characters who came before. This is often accompanied by the enemies and challenges in the game increasing in difficulty because the devs don't want these new, more powerful characters to just steamroll over the endgame. If nothing is done to counteract it, you will quickly find that the earliest characters are just worthless as far as the meta, along with any and all investment you put into them, and if you want to keep being able to beat the game's challenges, your only choice is to abandon all your old favorites, get out your credit card, and pull the newest characters. Obviously, for gacha games, this is a really easy way to make sure your new characters sell, but at the expense of the players' wallets and faith in the longevity of any character they pull. That said, sometimes the power level of the game can increase without older characters getting left behind, because new opportunities are created for them along the way. Technically, you could still say that's power creep because everything is getting stronger, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'm only going to consider something power creep if it's the bad kind, the kind where older characters do lose their spot in the meta. And when I say meta, I'm referring to clearing the Spiral Abyss with 36 stars, because that's the only endgame challenge in Genshin Impact that requires you to build good teams. Everything else you can clear with pretty much any random team you feel like. When it comes to the Spiral Abyss, if you look at this graph of total enemy hit points in the Abyss since 1.0, you can clearly see that it has gotten harder, at least in terms of DPS requirements. So the question is, did some characters lose the ability to clear the Abyss? To get specific, let's look at these tiers I'm going to use. Up top we have reversed power creep, which is for characters that provide some new mechanic that can bring older characters higher into the meta, which is what we want to see the most. Next we have got better for the recipients of those buffs. These are characters that are more meta now than when they came out. In the middle we have no change for characters who are pretty much just as good now as when they came out, and they didn't cause any major changes to the value of other characters. Now, for the unfortunate ones, we have the power creep tier for characters that increase the power level of the game just by existing. They don't necessarily make any prior character obsolete, but they do make Spiral Abyss easier if you have them. The more characters that are here, the more likely the enemies will need to be buffed to compensate, and that could result in more older characters that might have to be moved down to the bottom tier, which is where the bad power creep will be listed. Lost value is the one we don't want to see, because it means your prior investment might become obsolete. These characters used to have a solid place in the meta, but now it's harder to justify putting them onto your team. It might be due to better characters coming out, or it might be due to the Spiral Abyss getting harder and more restrictive. You can certainly still use them depending on the enemy arrangements in the current month's Abyss, but there is usually always a better option, so you are making the game harder on yourself by sticking to these characters instead of newer alternatives. As a final note before we start, let's mention constellations. Because this video is about changes to the meta over a long time, I am going to consider all 4 stars at C6. 5 stars, on the other hand, I'm only considering at C0, mostly because I don't pull for 5-star constellations. I'm also not going to bother to rate Traveler or Aloy, because Traveler is completely free and Aloy is effectively not in the game anymore. So first up, I'm gonna speedrun all of the characters where I don't have a lot to say because they simply fit right into the no change tier without issue. Amber, Kaeya, Xingqiu, Bennett, Chongyun, Sucrose, Ningguang, Qiqi, Mona, Klee, Diona, Childe, Xinyan, Hu Tao, Rosaria, Yanfei, Eula, Kazuha, Yoimiya, Yunjin, Yelan, Heizo, Sino, Layla, Wanderer, Alhaitham, Kirara, Lynette, Lyney, Freminet, Wriothesley, Charlotte, Navia, Gaming, Sethos, Sigewinne, Emily. And just to be clear, no, Yelan did not power creep Xingqiu, and Kazuha did not power creep Sucrose. As far as Hu Tao and Arlecchino, we'll get to that later. Next, one of the biggest things that buffed old characters was the addition of Dendro in 3.0, giving a huge increase in value to all Electro characters because of the Quicken and Bloom reactions. Here are the characters who got better just because of that. Lisa, Fischl, Razor, Yaimiko, Kuki Shinobu. Toma, while Pyro, also belongs here because of how good he is in Burgeon teams, which is another Bloom reaction. You may notice a few pre-3.0 Electro characters missing from that list, so let's go over them now. Beidou, like all Electro characters, got more team options once Dendro came out. However, she was already good before Dendro in teams like Taser, which is just as good as her Dendro teams. Additionally, she is usually competing with Fischl for a slot on teams, and Fischl is usually better, so I'm actually going to put her in no change. Keqing is a bit of a roller coaster. She was a limited 5-star when she came out, but now she's standard. As with all Electro characters, she got a huge buff in 3.0 with Dendro, however, during the 5.0 cycle, we got Clorinde, who definitely power-crept Keqing. Now, technically she is still way better now than when she came out, but given that this list is my opinion and I haven't touched my Keqing since I got Clorinde, I'm leaving her here. Kujou Sara has never been useful, outside of getting C6 and running Raiden Hyper Carry. and she can still do that, so no change. Raiden Shogun arguably got better with Dendro, but her best team was and still is Rational, so really no change. Moving on to the next special case, let's talk about Furina. Furina came out in 4.2, and she is possibly the best universal support in the game, but she requires that you slot a healer onto your team. The fact that she single-handedly puts all healers back into the meta means that she goes up top. Additionally, the Marashosei Hunter artifact set allows you to put almost any carry on the team with her, give them that artifact set, and they will be a viable carry. So, let's speedrun through all the healers that came out before Furina who got better on her release. Noelle, Jean, Sayu, Kokomi, Dori, Mika, Baiju. Also, there's 2 more healers who could be on this list that I want to mention separately. Barbara wasn't improved as much by Furina because you actually have to on-field her for her healing to be relevant, and that's a pretty big drawback. That said, she still got better because of Nilou's release, which we will talk about later. The other is Yaoyao, who was always a great Dendro healer and applies enough Dendro to enable quicken teams. Furina technically made her group healing more valuable, but in most teams where you have Furina plus a Dendro healer, you would much rather have Baiju instead. I said Yaoyao has enough Dendro to enable Quicken. I did not say she has enough Dendro to enable Hyper Bloom, which is immediately what the team will become as soon as you add Furina to it. So all that considered, Yaoyao's team options don't really improve because of Furina, so no change. But that's because they were already really good. The last special case I want to talk about is Xianyun. Xianyun makes every melee character into a plunge carry. That said, in order for them to be a good plunge carry, you need them to vaporize or melt their plunge attacks, so the other 2 characters on the team will need to provide very specific support. So while she doesn't single-handedly turn all melee characters into viable plunge carries, she is the key component, so she gets to go in Reverse's power creep. While I could say that every melee character can go and got better because of this, I decided to hold back a bit and only focus on 2. Diluc, who has an abnormally high plunge attack modifier. That, combined with the fact that he was a pretty weak carry before Xianyun, means he got better more so than others. And Kaveh, who was useless when he came out, probably the worst character in the game. So the fact that he can be played at all now without being a detriment to the team is a notable upgrade, but on top of that, Kaveh's plunge attack animation is faster than normal, so he benefits more than others as well. That's all the special cases that I wanted to handle first, so let's go through the remaining characters in release order and see where to place them. Xiangling is still one of the best off-field DPS in the entire game, and she always was. I would have put her in my first list, but Inazuma gave us both her best weapon and best artifact set, so she somehow got better. Venti was the first real limited banner 5-star character, which are the ones we really don't want to see get power crept. Unfortunately, he did. However, he was not power crept by any other character, but rather by the enemies. Venti was so overpowered in 1.0 that the devs had to find some way to bring him down, and they did that by making more and more enemies effectively immune to his elemental burst. If you're up against enemies where his burst works, then you win, but that's getting more and more rare in the Spiral Abyss to the point where he is borderline unplayable in any real challenge. When it comes to Zhongli, you could absolutely argue that he made the game easier, which was one of my criteria for a power creep character. However, I also said I'm specifically judging units relative to the Spiral Abyss. While he might keep you alive in the Spiral Abyss, he won't help you kill things any faster, and since Spiral Abyss is a time challenge, I'm putting him in no change. Especially since in recent Abysses, even his shield won't keep you alive if you don't avoid some attacks. Albedo I don't have, so I can't give a real opinion. However, based on other people's opinions, it seems to be popular consensus that he was power crept by Chiori. They are both Geo supports, and she's just better at it, so you usually don't have room for both of them on your team. So I'll say he is another victim who was power crept. Ganyu is also hard to place for me because I didn't play her when she came out. Back in the day, she was apparently pretty great, at least I saw videos of people soloing Spiral Abyss with C0 Ganyu. Now, playing her as a carry in the Abyss feels pretty awful and only works against certain enemies. However, you can still play her as an off-fielder because her elemental burst is still really strong. Either way, I would say that she got power crept. Zhao was originally the only plunge attack carry, so his unique playstyle was value in itself. However, Xianyun turns every character into a plunge attack carry, so his novelty is gone. But that pales in comparison to the massive buff he got when Faruzan came out, so he absolutely got better. Ayaka is still the best freeze carry. That said, freeze as a whole is a little spotty. It's kind of like Venti. When it works, you win. But unlike Venti, when it doesn't work, it is still usable. And either way, the endgame has always been like that, where sometimes certain teams aren't as strong against certain challenges. Personally, I'm going to put her in no change, but you could argue for lost value because it does kinda seem like Freeze is getting the short end of the stick more often than not nowadays. Goro's purpose hasn't changed in that he is the only defense buffer and the default support option for mono Geo teams with carries who scale with defense. However, the increased team building options for Geo carries has made mono Geo less appealing. But it wasn't until Xilonen released in 5.1 that I would say all mono Geo teams, and thus all of Goro's teams, are now better off if you only run Xilonen plus your Geo carry than 2 non-Geo characters, so at this point I would say he has lost value. Speaking of Geo carries, Itto is also pretty much the same. As I just said, he has more team building options now than when he came out, but the teams aren't really that much better than mono Geo, so no change. Shenhe is another complicated one. She's still the best cryo buffer in the game, but it has become harder to fit her onto teams. She can really only be played in mono cryo and freeze. No change as far as mono cryo, but freeze has so many more options now that a dedicated cryo buffer might not be what you want. But because these problems are all based in personal preference and her ability to buff cryo is still unmatched, I'm going to put her in no change, but she is right on the cusp. Ayato absolutely lost value when Neuvillette came out, because there's no longer a reason to play Ayato as a Hydro carry. He still has amazing off-field AoE Hydro application though, so he's not obsolete. With Collei, we have now entered 3.0. As we covered earlier, several characters who got better did so because of the release of Dendro in 3.0, and Collei was the first Dendro character. Well, her and Dendro Traveler, but both came out at the same time and both were free. The power of Dendro pretty much made Collei one of the most valuable characters in the game when she released, so she had nowhere to go but down. And down she went, because ultimately her primary purpose was to introduce the Dendro mechanics, so she was always meant to be power crept by future Dendro characters. The only reason to ever use Collei now is as a cope option if your account is new and you don't have other options yet. Still though, not obsolete. Tignari was the first Dendro 5-star and first Dendro carry. As with Collei, later Dendro carries like Alhaitham and Kinich are both better than him, so he did lose some value. That said, all of them excel in different teams, and although I said I wouldn't consider 5-star constellations, since he's on the standard banner, I'm going to mention them anyway. His cons are all nice upgrades, and if you manage to get him C6, he will absolutely regain any value that he lost. Candice was never that great, but she's a fine option in Nilou teams because of her Hydro Infusion, and at C6 she offers good off-field AoE Hydro application and a damage buff to certain melee characters, most notably Arlecchino once she released, so Candice actually got better. Nilou is the namesake of Nilou Bloom, a team that only exists because of her. Nilou Bloom provides a home to literally all wayward Hydro and Dendro characters, which arguably resulted in some reverse power creep, and why I put Barbara and got better if you remember. But she really needed Nahida to come out in the very next banner for her teams to really excel. Because of that, I don't think they both need to go into the top tier, but I will put her in got better because of Nahida. And here is Nahida. She is the best Dendro applier in the game, and as we've covered, Dendro enabled so many new teams when it came out. Because Nahida is the ultimate Dendro applier to this day, I'm giving her all the credit for all the improvements to team building that happened due to Dendro. Therefore, she goes up top. I'd also like to make a side note here about Hyperbloom. The interesting thing about Hyperbloom is that with Kuki Shinobu, Nahida, and Xingqiu, Hyperbloom is a 3-person team, and it's one of the best teams in the game, so technically, you can put the worst character in the game on that team, and it will still be amazing and way better than whatever team you could make with that character before, and thus claim that at a bare minimum, every character in the game got better at this point. But as you can see, I'm not going to judge previous characters based on that, but I did at least want to mention it. Faruzan is still the best Anemo buffer in the game, no change. That said, the reason I didn't just stick her in my initial list is because her release did make Zhao significantly better. However, since it was literally just him that got better, I'm not going to say she reversed power creep. Dehya was one of the biggest disappointments in the game when she came out, but since then, several characters have come out that actually value the utility she provides, so she actually got better. Neuvillette. This is the character that made everyone worry that power creep had finally come to Genshin, and they have a point. He's the best DPS in the game without question, and it's not close. Some feared that everyone would be forced to pull him or never clear endgame again. Thankfully that hasn't happened yet, but as I said at the start, if more characters of this power level are added, then it probably will. Chevreuse single-handedly made Overload teams good. The thing is, every character that you'd put on those teams was already good, so she didn't actually make any characters stronger. She just gave those characters another team. You could certainly argue that since she's locked to Electro and Pyro, that all subpar Electro and Pyro characters got a boost because of her, but they are still much worse teammates than the Pyro and Electro characters that are actually good, of which there are plenty. So I am putting her in no change instead of reverses power creep. Chiori is an excellent Geo support. I already said she power crept Albedo, but that was more because Albedo doesn't do anything better than her, not because she's overpowered, so she does not cause power creep in the game as a whole. No change. As an inverse of that, Arlecchino is probably the second best carry in the game. Some say that she power crept Hu Tao, but the reality is both of them have different characters in their best teams, and both of them are still competitive in the endgame. So Hu Tao is still a meta character, despite Arlecchino arguably being a stronger Pyro carry. That said, Arlecchino is still an insanely strong character who is easy to build around and play, so I think she does increase the overall power level of the game. I'm gonna have to put her in power creep. Clorinde power crept Keqing, as we already covered, but power creeping one character doesn't necessarily mean you increased the power level of the game, as I mentioned with Chiori, which Clorinde didn't, so she just goes in no change. With Kachina, we are now in 5.0. The thing to note about 5.0 is that the strength of all Natlan characters is reliant upon the two new artifact sets, which are the two best artifact sets in the entire game, but only Natlan characters can utilize them. Now, you could argue that that in itself is power creep, but it does depend on who you put them on. For that reason, all Natlan characters will take these sets into account when I judge their power levels. That said, as Collei with Nahida, Kachina was instantly power crept by Xilonen. But also like Collei, that was by design, as Kachina's purpose was to be a free intro to the Natlan mechanics. The only reason Kachina is not obsolete is because of that Natlan support artifact set I mentioned. Mualani, Kinich, Auroran, and Chaska are all recent Natlan characters. The 5 stars all add unique playstyles, partially due to their travel mechanics, but they didn't power creep any existing character. And Auroran is just Electro Natlan support guy, so it's possible he'll lose value when more Natlan supports come out, just as those carries might get better. For now, they all go in no change. Xilonen is one of the best supports in the game, but being a support makes it hard to place her on this list. You could argue she reverses power creep because supports inherently make other characters better, but not really, because if she buffs a bad character, then she probably buffs a good character even more, so she didn't reverse anything. I am going to put her into power creep. Not so much because she's better than any specific supports, but rather because putting her onto a team necessarily means another character has to be kicked off, even if it's a support that helped the team in a way that she might not, and because she's so strong, the team with her will probably be better than it was before. So not only do those supports lose value because they can't fit onto their teams anymore, but said teams are now more powerful. It's hard to argue that that's not power creep. That is my list as far as 5.2. However, in 5.3 we have 3 characters that could mix things up a bit more, though we haven't quite had enough time with them yet to make any definite statements, so these are just my guesses. Citlali is a cryo shielder meant to buff melt and freeze, and she can use both the Natlan artifact set and, because she's a catalyst, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which is one of the best support weapons in the game. These two things considered, she may very well power creep other cryo shielders and supports, and she might put some carries that rely on melt higher into the meta. So for my speculative 5.3 list, I'm going to move Diona and Layla down because I can't imagine playing them over Citlali. And I'm also going to move Shenhe down because I already said she was on the cusp, and Citlali provides yet another alternative to her. That said, I'll move Gaming up, since a support like this is just what he needed. As for Citlali herself, I'll put her into no change, because none of those characters had a strong place in the meta as is. Malwika is an incredibly strong DPS, but she is somewhat reliant on Natlan supports like Xilonen and Citlali to achieve anywhere near her full potential. If you have enough wishes to pull for her best team and get them built, it will probably be the best team in the game, so I'm going to put her in power creep preemptively. Lastly, Lanyan is a shielder who can hold both VV and TTDS, which makes her pretty valuable to a lot of teams. That said, I don't think she will upset the meta, so I'll put her in no change. So looking at the final list, the majority of characters haven't really changed in value since their release. On top of that, about twice as many characters got better over time than those who got worse over time. Looking closer at the ones who've gotten worse, we have 2 that were free introductory characters, so there was never any expectation that they would stay useful. As for the rest, it is a little unfortunate, but most of them are are still viable if you want to use them, so that is a little power creep, but all things considered, I'd say most gacha games have it a lot worse. As far as the powerhouses that are causing the power creep, we do have a few and are adding more gradually. Granted, it started with Neuvillette, and so far he is the best of the group, so while the additional characters here are somewhat concerning, we don't exactly have a trend yet. So, does Genshin Impact suffer from power creep? No. Even if we ignore all the characters who got better over time, power creep is only a problem if you need to pull the latest characters to keep up with the meta, and the fact is that you absolutely do not have to do that to 36-star Spiral Abyss. Not just because of difficulty, but also because of just how good some of the early characters are. Bennett, Zhongling, Xingqiu, and Fischl are 4 of the best characters in the entire game, and they are all 4 stars who have been here since 1.0, and you don't even have to get them from a banner because you can buy them in the Starglitter shop. Furthermore, every Abyss cycle has people succeeding in challenge runs with 4 stars only, and when it's particularly difficult to do so, such as in the Abyss when this video was recorded, it's more because of unfair combinations of enemies than it is the enemies themselves being too strong. A Neuvillette tier character coming out does not mean power creep is now a problem, so long as the game's difficulty does not raise to match him, and it hasn't. Thanks for watching. At the end of the day, Genshin Impact combat isn't about characters, it's about teams, and every character will always have a team you can put them on that can succeed.
It's Hyperbloom. The team is Hyperbloom.